Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's breakout session on the future of work, information, surveillance, and workplace control in the new economy. We're very happy everyone's here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I thought I would, we've got, I guess, 4 papers and 2 commentators, so we're going to try to move quite quickly. We'll have about 8 minutes, try to keep, presentations to 8 minutes. And what I'll do is give a 2-minute warning to all of the speakers. And I thought just to keep things going quickly, I'd do all the introductions now. And then we can, I can just sort of, give people's names when it's time to get started. And that will, with luck, leave us some time at the end for a general discussion. So just to go through the panelist introductions, we've got a fantastic panel today of people doing empirical and other sorts of work on information surveillance and workplace control. First off, we will have Kathryn Zickuhr, who's a labor market policy analyst at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, where she studies the impact of technology and the future of work. Kathryn holds an MPP from Georgetown University and BA from the University of Kansas, presenting what I gather is a report entitled The Future of Worker Surveillance. Next, we'll then have Alexandra Mateescu, hope I didn't butcher that, who's a researcher at the Labor Futures Initiative at Data and Society, where she works on issues related to the intersections of technology, platform labor, and care work. And Alexandra holds an MA and BA in anthropology from the University of Chicago, presenting either a report or a paper, maybe you could tell us, workplace monitoring and surveillance in the domestic care industry. I am possibly about to sneeze, so sorry if I do. Luke Elliott Negri is a doctoral candidate in sociology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Among other work, he's the co-author of a book project about social movement success and failure, which is forthcoming with Oxford University Press. Presenting a co-written piece, Back to the Future, Algorithmically Obscured Piece Rate Pay and Worker Resistance in the Gig Economy. And then finally, for panelists, Jasmine Hill is incoming, congratulations, assistant professor of public policy and sociology at UCLA, who's now finishing her doctoral degree in sociology at Stanford. And her scholarship explores both the causes and consequences of social mobility for Black Americans, presenting a paper that's now under review entitled Misinformed Informal Knowledge as a Neglected Challenge to Racial Inequality. We also have 2 fantastic discussants I'll introduce very quickly. First, Annetta Bernhardt, who's director of the Technology and Work Program at the UC Berkeley Labor Center, as well as a senior researcher at the Berkeley Institute for Research on Labor and Employment. Annetta received her PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago. And then Chandra Childers, who's a study director at the Institute for Women's Policy Research, who works on the economic security, mobility, and equity team at IWPR, conducting research on employment, earnings, job quality, and the future of work for women generally, and for Black, Latina, and other women of color. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Let me just go ahead and get us started by turning it over to Kathryn for her paper, The Future of Worker Surveillance.
Excellent, thank you. And let me just double check. Great. So thank you so much, Brishen. Am I not sharing again?
There we go. I don't see it. There it is.
There we go.
Oh, sorry, one thing, Kathryn, if I could ask folks who are not speaking just to try to remain muted to keep the background noise down.
Right. So my name is Kathryn Zickuhr. I'm a labor market policy analyst with the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, and I'm excited to talk to you today about a report in progress on worker surveillance. And I'm trying to get to a few questions here. So why does surveillance matter, especially from a labor context, from an economic context? What are the harms to workers, and where do we want to go from here? So one reason I want to talk about, I'm thinking about why surveillance matters is that we don't have a strong sense of privacy rights legally in the United States as consumers, and we certainly don't really have many rights as workers. So workers have just a few privacy protections, often around particular types of data used in certain contexts, and sometimes states pass legislation, but for the most part, workers aren't really protected. And this is also a challenge because privacy harms are difficult to identify, let alone quantify. It's sometimes difficult to know if you're being surveilled, but if when your privacy has been violated, if you experience harms, we'll get to some of those later, but discrimination, for instance, difficult to know if that has happened because of the privacy violation. It might not happen now, it might happen down the line. So, but also in sort of our evolving technological landscape, some forms of surveillance are sort of come to the fore. So surveillance is not new to work, but technology does enable dramatic changes in both the scale of surveillance and the creation of new forms of surveillance in ways that are really important for workers. And as many of the reports and researchers and policy experts that I'm referring to today detail, the broader labor trends in the United States and our policy landscape enable employers to surveil workers in these ways and leave workers vulnerable, both to fairly limitless surveillance and also to many of the harms that come from that and other often sort of technologically enabled practices like algorithmic management that are connected to the surveillance. So my slides are available on the Box folder, but these are just some of the pieces that I'm referring to most frequently today. And when thinking about harms to workers, I'm trying to think of them in a few different ways. So we have the main ways that surveillance enables worker exploitation or direct harms to workers, both from the surveillance itself and then again from some of these other practices that it enables. So one example of this that is in the news a lot, and including in the past week, is in highly surveilled and quantified warehouses. For instance, the surveillance is necessary for monitoring workers as they are pushed to keep punishing paces of work, impossible paces of work, which leads to injuries and overwork. Surveillance also connects to other practices such as unpredictable scheduling, this collection of data. Surveillance can also lead to many forms of discrimination that are invisible to the worker. Discrimination is, many of these things are illegal, or in many forms, like discrimination is illegal, but it's difficult to identify and enforce in our current landscape. And there's also some harms that are direct from surveillance, such as the pervasive just monitoring, lack of privacy, this stress that is both, it takes cognitive toll, it can take a physical toll, it's chronic, it's very difficult to sort of quantify, but it's certainly there. And then some counterproductive incentives that actually might be more harmful to the employer than to the worker, but essentially trying to please an algorithm, an opaque algorithm, instead of doing your job the way it should be done, or in a way that is best for customers or clients. And then this is something that, there's some other broader harms from surveillance that our chair, Brishen has written about, for instance, how it undermines worker power by changing the structure of jobs and conditions of work, is very closely connected to a lot of de-skilling, this constant data collection on workers and their actions, and also fissured work, where it's necessary in some ways for some forms of fissuring, and then also once the work is spread out and outsourced or spread to other workers, the surveillance is then necessary to monitor quality, to monitor the workers sort of across the supply chain, across these different entities who are not necessarily employers of the lead firm. And then surveillance is also a barrier to organizing, even when it's not explicitly part of anti-union activity. And surveillance around anti-union activity or around unionization or worker collective action is one of those things that is protected, one of the few privacy protections workers do have. But if your employer is essentially surveilling you all the time, if they're already monitoring your communications, your association with other people at work, your movements, both on and off the job, they don't necessarily need to add in any new form of surveillance to be aware in that context. And also simply surveillance is about power. Like, it's about information, it's about power, and it shifts the power entirely to the employer. So in thinking about what we want our future of work surveillance to be, I would just say that this isn't about where technology is headed, where technology is taking work, because technology at the end of the day is a series of decisions. Technological products are created by people, designed by people, sold by people, purchased by people, by companies, and then people choose how and when to use them in the workplace. And there are a lot of opportunities for policy and other actions here to shape the sort of future that we want. So some of these, there are a lot of recommendations around enhancing worker privacy and protecting workers. And one of the sets of recommendations that I find particularly useful are some from the Center for Privacy Technology at Georgetown Law. But a lot of them start with limits on simply the collection, use, and storage of data about workers, which again goes far beyond like the type of information that's filled in on a form. It's it can be all the actions that you take on a computer, or your movements as tracked by a GPS, or a wearable device, or biometric information. There's so much data that can be collected about workers. So simply imposing some limits on the collection, use, and storage of that, and also transparency, because workers often don't know how they're being surveilled, how that data is used. Transparency for unions who are already bargaining over technology and over algorithms, things like that, and transparency for government agencies for oversight purposes. And then we got to this moment in work surveillance, like the shape that it takes right now and all the different ways it's affecting workers, especially low-wage workers, because of structural factors. And so addressing some of those structural factors will be vital to creating this future that we want. So we can get more into this, but essentially recommendations around strengthening worker power, addressing distorted labor markets, ending exploitative work arrangements, ending practices that are already illegal through enforcement or other approaches. There's a lot of recommendations around these approaches that will address the structural forces and also create a policy landscape that can adjust to the technology, to technological new products that will be developed down the line and not just today. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And ending right on time. I'm worried my phone, where I had there it is. My phone is going to buzz in just a second. Sorry. Okay, there we go. So up next, we have Alexandra presenting workplace monitoring and surveillance in the domestic care industry.
Great, thank you. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, here we go. Can everyone see? All right, so thank you so much. So my presentation is going to be a brief discussion of an in-progress report on one instance of workplace monitoring called electronic visit verification. So this is based on research conducted this past year, doing interviews with personal care aides and Medicaid service recipients within home and community-based services across the country, as well as drawing on sort of the range of ongoing public dialogues and mobilizations around the issue. So to give some background on a very messy and complex issue, back in 2016, Congress passed the 21st Century Cures Act, which was a broad piece of legislation that included a not very well publicized provision, basically requiring all Medicaid reimbursed personal care services and home health care services to use what are called electronic visit verification systems. So EVV is basically a smartphone app or a smartphone type device that records dates and times and some other data points of when personal care attendants visit their clients and provide services. So on its surface, this doesn't appear particularly controversial. Digital timekeeping phones are, of course, incredibly common across workplaces, expected to clock in and out of work. However, there are several important things to note. Firstly, the requirement to roll out EVV systems was part of wider policy ambitions to eliminate, quote, fraud, waste, and abuse in provision of home care services. There was a 2016 report from the Congressional Budget Office that claimed that universal mandatory use of EVV systems would eventually lead to cost savings via cuts in direct spending by $290 million over a 10-year period. So from the start, there was sort of an assumption, and one that tech vendors have very much played up in their marketing, that there are significant levels of fraud committed by home care workers and that EVV systems are going to stop that. Secondly, the issue is that both tech designers and state level policies on EVV encoded far more invasive data collection practices than what was originally required in the legislation. So this includes features like GPS location tracking, biometric data collection like facial recognition and voice verification. Workers often are required to log their hours in real time, and in some states, workers are only allowed to clock in and out at the service recipient's home or at expected service locations. So this elicited public backlash from the start, both from labor, but particularly from the disability rights community. Both lives and livelihoods were sort of unsettled by rollouts across the country that often happened with little notice, and stakeholders were often really only consulted post talks in some very tense town halls and information sessions hosted by state health departments and CMS. So efforts to sort of create systems that took into account the many concerns from workers and service recipients faced challenges. So in states like California, United Domestic Workers and organizations like Disability Rights California advocated for and collaborated with stakeholders to develop like a more less invasive in-house version of EBB that did collect data like GPS. But then CMS essentially came back and said that that system was not going to actually be compliant with the mandate. So I just want to sort of give a sense from my fieldwork of why what was presented as a mere digital upgrade from paper timesheets was a lot more complicated than that. Firstly, there were a lot of hidden costs and burdens. So EBB systems overall have been incredibly glitchy. They're often not like accurately recording the GPS location data, and they basically, in some cases, enable the form of digital wage theft, where workers are losing hours or even weeks worth of pay with little like recourse to it. A lot of rigid rules around where services had to be provided placed a lot of pressures on workers to do unpaid work. So there ended up being a lot of invisible administrative work that went into essentially making their work actually legible to EBB systems. And of course, a lot of the financial costs like smartphones, phone plans, learning how to use these systems often fell on workers. Issues around privacy and autonomy. So workers were constantly getting flagged for very minor things. And this contributed to sort of pervasive fear about the scrutiny it might draw. And of course, by surveilling workers, these systems also de facto monitor the people that they're providing services to. This is particularly limiting to the autonomy of disabled service recipients, where service location requirements in some cases basically force them to be confined to their homes. And there was very little communication about what data EBB systems were actually collecting. So I kept hearing fears about like, is this app actually collecting audio? When is the GPS actually like tracking me? There were a lot of sort of comparisons that came up to like ankle monitors in the criminal justice system. And as well as sort of impacts on service provision. So like location data is kind of used as a very blunt proxy for care quality. There's a lot of pressure on workers to perform compliance. A lot of the public backlash particularly came within consumer-directed services where aides are hired and trained and managed, and they're by the service recipients and often it's family members who are hired to do so. So there was a lot of sort of guilt and pressure that you're basically pressuring your family member to be tracked in order to receive, critical services. However, and just to sort of conclude, I don't want this to just be a story about incredibly poor UX design, although there's a lot of that within this story. So just to sort of bring up some themes, there's sort of the intersection of workplace surveillance and public welfare benefits. Virginia Eubanks' work has really highlighted the ways that automated benefits eligibility systems could sort of justify a narrative of austerity. So I guess it's important to think about how worker monitoring may intersect with these trends. There's definitely a lot of fears that I heard about how EBB data may be used to make other kinds of decisions, like decisions about how many care hours are allocated to service recipients. The sort of theme of timekeeping as control. So timekeeping is being neither passive nor neutral. How it's done, these sort of assumptions built into the technology can have very tangible experiences on work. In industries like home care, the impacts go beyond just workers in the workplace. So elderly and disabled service recipients, the family members of people who receive services, all of them are sort of impacted by this. And I think it's important to talk about who has a stake in the future of worker surveillance, and often it's not just workers. And then finally, sort of the role of government and worker surveillance, because these systems were mandated on the federal level, and it's been incredibly difficult to try to figure out the avenues of like pushback for this. So like there's been efforts to like try to create draft legislation to like proactively ban the use of biometric data collection in EDD systems, but it's like the avenue to be able to limit this once it's been rolled out can be incredibly difficult. So that's just a general overview of this research, which will likely be published later in the fall. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Alexandra. Up next, we have Luke Elliott-Negri. We'll take just a moment to take the screen sharing down and all.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, Luke Elliott-Negri at the CUNY Graduate Center. Pleased to be here with everyone on such a great panel. I think given the truncated time frame, I'm going to make it through about 2 slides. I like to be disciplined about sticking to the time that's been allotted. I just want to say that this paper emerges from an ongoing collaboration between me and Ruth Milkman at the CUNY Graduate Center and some colleagues at Columbia, including Adam Reich and Suresh Naidu and Kathleen Grisbach, who's now in Europe. And because I'm sitting on the panel with someone from Center for Equitable Growth, we are currently funded by you all, and thank you very much, doing some further research on how consumers of groceries delivered to their home think about workers and worker organizing, especially in the context of COVID. So for this paper, this is the first slide we'll get through. Between October 2018 and February 2019, a group of us surveyed just short of 1,000 platform-based food delivery workers across a range of platforms, and then did follow-up interviews with 55 of those, and I've published a couple of papers off of that data. But in one of the interviews, we stumbled on a worker who was involved in worker organizing. And I should say the focus of this paper, for those who haven't seen it yet, is really on worker resistance in the gig economy. So a slightly different angle than what we've heard so far on the panel. And gosh, I don't have the quote right in front of me, but the worker said something like, "Oh, you should talk to so-and-so. We just do whatever she tells us to do." So we did a small snowball process of finding some of the workers who've been leading organizing efforts at Instacart and interviewing those folks, as well as later on in their organizing efforts, someone from Working Washington, which is an SEIU-funded outfit in the Pacific Northwest, about their interventions in this organizing. And then, I began to read secondary sources, right? A lot of this has been reported in the media in addition to talking to these workers. And somewhere in this process, I thought, this is so weird. Like this is something very different than what I'm used to seeing. There were these kind of sporadic conflicts. This group of workers with very little kind of top-down support from any organization, almost none in most cases. And with no money, were fighting and in some cases winning concessions from Instacart, from this platform, then sometimes fighting and losing. But I came to think, as I was digging into this feels like the 19th century minus guns, right? Like in the 19th century, all these skirmishes, but there was a lot of death. But this just felt like a very skirmish-based set of conflicts, and just not like other 21st century labor conflicts that I had stumbled onto. So I became very intrigued, and I will, in my short time remaining, I think just try to convey the basic argument of the paper and not get too much into the kind of basically what's a history of the 5 years of conflict between Instacart workers and their employer that's in this paper. So the first bit is this. There's a lot made in the gig economy literature on the independent contractor status and the way that enables employers to evade labor law. But what struck me in digging in on this worker resistance is that the piece rate nature of the pay, was really definitive of the experience that workers had, and also of the forms of resistance that they organized. And so I'm sure many folks know this, but piece rate pay is legal under the Fair Labor Standards Act. It was legal before it. It's legal after it. And so this is there's kind of a tangential question here about why employers are now choosing to use the piece rate pay. But in any case, in digging into this research, it became clear to me that this was something that really was, again, definitive of the experience that workers had at Instacart. And And so that means something really specific for worker resistance, that there is a tendency when workers resist piece rate pay to have this central demand of transparency in the piece rate and stability of the piece rate. So we might kind of intuitively feel, as folks who've studied, workers working for a wage, that they might want to pivot to the wage or have some stable hourly rate. But in fact, the demands here are for transparency and stability of the piece rate. And then I'm quoting from David Montgomery in The Fall of the House of Labor here, but that also the resistance is militant, sporadic, and recurring. And so at some point during this qualitative research, I pulled The Fall of the House of Labor off my bookshelf. I hadn't looked at it in quite some time. And I found entire paragraphs in this book describing conflicts between piece rate workers and their employers, these semi-skilled operatives in the 19th century, entire paragraphs that I could just plug in whole to describe the conflict that I was discovering both through interviewing workers and reading secondary sources about these conflicts over the last 5 years at Instacart. So yeah, that is the core argument of this paper, that in thinking about the nature of the gig economy, we need to focus a bit more than we have. Again, this is not exclusive, right? But I think not just on independent contractor status, but on the nature of compensation, that it is some version of the piece rate obscured by the algorithm in the case of Instacart and in other cases, but nonetheless, it is a rate for a particular service, not for an amount of time, and that shapes the worker experience, and then it shapes the nature of the resistance that they will then go on to organize. How much time do I have? I didn't start a clock.
You have exactly 2 minutes. I was about to text you to tell you. Okay,
great, thanks. Yeah, I had timed this at 6 minutes, so this was about where I was going to end. But then I'll just briefly describe, the kind of empirical arc that goes on. It's almost like too neat, but this is the way it is. So there was this initial conflict at Instacart in 2016 between workers organized by these 3 workers, 2 from the Bay Area and 1 from the Midwest, that found each other on Instagram. And they organized a strike, basically a kind of little militant minority strike. And 2 days before they were to execute that strike, they won concessions from the employer, changes to the way that the algorithm kind of compensated them. The next year, they organized a similar effort and got crushed. And in fact, Instacart made the algorithm worse in response to their organizing effort. The year after, they organized a strike again, and this time won concessions. And then the year after that, got crushed again. So there's this really just weird, it just does not map onto any worker resistance kind of pattern that I've seen in the kind of stories that we're used to thinking about in the late 20th and early 21st century, where, as the labor movement has declined, you need these kind of revitalized union organizations to fund strategic campaigns from the top down and all these efforts to do worker organizing. Here you have these folks who are just with like 8 cents in their pockets, organizing, in some cases successful, in other cases unsuccessful resistance. And again, the argument here is that the nature of that conflict and the kind of the motivation of those workers and also in some ways the willingness of the employer to concede has to do with the fluctuating nature of the piece rate pay that's at the center of these conflicts. So I'll stop there and welcome any conversation when we get there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Luke. Finally, Jasmine Hill, presenting Good Jobs, Bad Intel, How Racial Inequality Persists in the Information Age. Oh, misinformed. I'm sorry. I had the title from my.
Oh, you're fine.
Yeah.
It's an ever-changing title because it's both a paper and a book project. But I'm so happy to be here with you all today. Can you see my slides? Okay. Can I just get a thumbs up if you're seeing? I made the mistake once of also doing the presenter view, which was terrible. So thank you for that. So as others have said, with the time I've been allotted, this is a project that leans heavily on ethnographic and interview data. And so like the other panelists, you might think of my brief remarks today as a provocation as opposed to a full layout of the argument and the data in my work. But I'm so excited to talk with you today. So this project is really provoked by the social problem of working poverty, which we know disproportionately impacts people of color in this country. And certainly as a result of the pandemic, will continue to have deeply racially unequal consequences in the United States. Most commonly, we tell those experiencing working poverty, we instruct them, if you're seeking upward mobility, that you should get a bachelor's degree. And of course, important work by Florencia Torche and others emphasize that indeed, if we can get people to college, it's a powerful tool for social mobility. But as many sociologists and scholars of education note, the inaccessibility and rising cost of college attendance make it an increasingly inaccessible route for Black and Brown opportunity seekers. And so my project really revolves around two central questions. The first thing is, I'm curious from a historical perspective, what are the occupational paths into the middle class and out of working poverty, particularly for those without a college degree, which, as a reminder, although sometimes it's easy to forget on panels like these, that is the majority of Americans are sub-baccalaureate, Black, white, or otherwise. And then the second question is I'm really interested in is particularly for Black opportunity seekers, what do we tell them are the pathways into the middle class, right? So what is the difference between what is working and what is actually told by the workforce development centers system, what is told to them by schools, so on and so forth. And I asked these questions because Angel Harris said in 2008 that a lack of focus on the different types of beliefs about the opportunity structure leads to an incomplete understanding about how the perceptions about the system of social mobility affects labor market behavior. So my argument here is that the information that folks have about how social mobility happens directly impacts their behaviors in the labor market. And so my work is certainly extending a tradition of thinking about social stratification beliefs, but certainly thinking about it more from an institutional perspective, placing the responsibility on our systems for how they're portraying messages about social mobility and opportunity. And I take on this project through a variety of methods. Like I mentioned, I look at a historical picture of occupations to consider what are those jobs that offer access to the middle class for folks without a bachelor's degree. And of course, I sort those things out by along dimensions of race and gender. But then I participated in an 18-month ethnography of a small suburban community in Los Angeles, Inglewood, California, where I participated in observations of workforce development systems, schools, job fairs, city hall events, community events, and through that got a sample of 87 in-depth interviews. And I should say in these interviews, I interviewed men and women between the ages of 18 and 39. My sample also, I wanted to include a comparison to understand how these dynamics are racialized, particularly for Black Americans. So I include Latinx folks in the respondent pool as well to understand how these kind of occupational segregation, which is quite prominent and distinct in Los Angeles, happen between the Black and Latino community. So we'll jump right into it. The thing that I first kind of take up is what are the pathways, and thinking about when this data was, when my interviews were collected in 2017, I used kind of Arnie Kallenberg's definition of a good job to think of those occupations that would earn a person the median household income in Los Angeles County, and where 51% of the workers or more don't hold bachelor's degrees. And for those who think about the labor market, it might not surprise you that unfortunately in 2018, all of those jobs that would put someone into the middle class and did not require a bachelor's degree, unfortunately, can fit on one slide, right? So these are 24 occupations here in the United States that offer above, kind of at or above median income. And you'll see a lot of things that, of course, the story that these are male-dominated occupations. These are union jobs. So this is definitely a story about union decline. And it speaks to how radically we need to transform and expand this list. And so it goes beyond 24. There are certainly racialized complications for this because, again, all of these jobs are not equally accessible. So for Black workers, particularly, this list shifts down to just 17 occupations that Black workers actually find themselves in. And so this kind of conceived a concept that I began to talk about in my work of how Black workers, particularly, we all live in a time of deep inequality that hurts sub-baccalaureate workers, and Black workers particularly don't necessarily even live in labor markets. We might think of it using and borrowing from the food desert metaphor that Black workers live in labor deserts. So with such limited opportunity for Black workers particularly, but for all sub-baccalaureate workers in general, we would hope that our workforce development system is helping to direct people to those few opportunities that would lead them into the middle class. And what I find, unfortunately, is that institutions, and I'm also happy to be on a panel with folks thinking about surveillance and also the gig economy, that these forces also are unfortunately, predators that are telling workers that there's much more opportunity than there actually is, that all jobs are good jobs, and that kind of anything they pursue would lead them to the middle class, which is just certainly not the case. One of those consequences comes from the impact of WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act, which many of us are familiar with, we know and love. This is a figure from the Inglewood One-Stop Job Center, where I did a lot of observation. This is coming from their annual report. And long story short, what they are praising themselves on is having a goal of placing a certain amount of workers into occupations, and they're celebrating exceeding that rate by 124% fold. But what you'll find if you go and spend any time at a one-stop job center, and particularly in Inglewood, the types of occupations that they're directing workers to are low-wage occupations like working in the Amazon warehouse, or you see the official branding of the one-stop job center here, advertising and promoting work at a Panda Express. We know this is a consequence of WIOA being about first and foremost getting people employed, but the argument here is that they're essentially ushering people into working poverty, and also sending a message to workers that these are the jobs that are available. These are quality jobs because they're issued from a government agency. And my argument is that this has a direct impact on workers' decisions in the labor market. These are coming from official institutions. Let's not talk at all about information that they're gaining on social media, from the gig economy, and from for-profit colleges, as the work of Tressie McMillan Cotton talks about, in trying to suck them into kind of industries that don't particularly pay well. This also happens in schools. I'll quickly run through some field notes I had of an observation. This is a class period that I was observing that was specifically working with high school seniors who they knew at the point in the school year were not going to attend college. And Andrea is the teacher in this classroom, and she's trying to get these students to do a worksheet and asking them questions about their post-high school plans. She asked them, what type of business do you want to get into? There's a girl with braids that says, I want to get into jewelry. The teacher responds by saying, that's a good business, and shares a story about a friend of hers who sells bracelets for $50. A Latino student interrupts the teacher and asks what I think is the quintessential question. He says, well, how much money do I need? Which is in a county as expensive as Los Angeles County, I think is the quintessential question that we would hope that teachers and our Workforce Development Center are equipping job seekers with this type of information so they can strategize in a very unequal and racialized job market. But instead, the teacher turns into a Socratic moment and says, good question, what do you all think? Turning it back to the class. The conversation moves on without answering the boys' question about the cost of living. Andrea then asks if any of the students like computers, which is quite exciting. Los Angeles is experiencing a bit of a tech renaissance. So I kind of perk up as two Black boys raise their hands. The teacher then says, good, you might want to work at GameStop or Fry's, which for those who aren't familiar are two big box, low wage retail chains. And so my argument here is that pending the point in which we can dramatically expand the number of jobs that facilitate access to the middle class, at this particular moment, we've created, unfortunately, a need for what I call mobility knowledge, which is accurate, niche, and time-sensitive information about how social mobility occurs, about which jobs are good and which are bad, and the present state of inequality. That looks like telling workers about the state of racial inequality, about the kinds of discrimination that they might face in the labor market, and at how truncated the number of jobs and which those are that are actually worth seeking out. Because again, as I've sort of alluded to, there are both institutions that are sending them the wrong directions, and certainly predators that are actively trying to lure them into very low wage work. The last anecdote I'll share is that at the high school graduation, where I observed when you left the graduation, every single car had a flyer to become advertising the opportunity to become a home health aide, which for those who are familiar, we know that there are many quality nursing professions, some of which pay very well, even for sub-baccalaureate participants. But home health aide is an extremely difficult kind of occupation on the body that often pays below poverty wages. So my conclusion here that that I'm hoping as I speed through this is to leave you with the idea that particularly Black workers are, as we all know, in a time of facing extreme labor market inequality. And we might think of them, particularly because of the consequences of residential segregation, as living in labor deserts. And it raises this issue that there's a great deal, even in those kind of deeply unequal labor market conditions, that they're not only have limited chances, but they're receiving a great deal of inaccurate information about the labor market, coming both from institutions with good intentions and those sometimes without. And so towards interrupting working poverty, Black workers particularly need mobility knowledge, that term that I coined, pending labor market transformation. So as we sort out how we're going to facilitate more access to the middle class, right now, there's a lot of need for policymakers and practitioners to begin to dispel some of the inaccurate information that workers face, which I'm arguing leads them to suboptimal choices in their labor market selections and kind of furthering the problem of racialized working poverty. But the thing that this work makes me think about a lot is kind of in our larger discourse, we've adopted maybe a comfort with thinking and talking about anti-racism and how structural racism might show up in our workplaces. But what I find most fascinating is that in my ethnographic work and interviews with low-income Black and brown folks, there seems to be a real hesitance towards talking about systemic racism to those most affected by those in a practical way in the labor market, which is quite an interesting thing to think about, that those most affected are those most shielded and given messages that there is lots of opportunity, that they can do anything they put their mind to, when we know that systemic racism will actually make something dramatically different for Black workers particularly. And so again, my advocacy here is absolutely for a transformation of the labor market. And in the meantime, why not talk more openly about and help people dispel the inaccurate information that they're facing from a variety of institutions. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. What a great set of papers. So as I said at the beginning, we have two commentators, discussants. First off, Annetta Bernhardt.
Hi, good morning, everybody. These were great papers. I'm very glad to have had the chance to read them. I am going to focus on the parts of these papers that focus on the impact of new technologies on work. And at the Labor Center, we've been running for the last year and a half a project that's been working with worker advocates to develop a policy model for workers' rights around new data-driven technologies like data capture, electronic monitoring, algorithmic management. And I'm finding that policy, I'm both a researcher and a policy geek, and policy is a really useful lens for thinking about what we need from research into this emerging body of tech. So here's some really important points that came through in the papers that are critical for policy development that I wanted to lift up. First is, like I think Kathryn laid out, workers experience a much broader set of harms from these technologies than just privacy. Discrimination, economic instability, harmful impacts on health and safety, lower wages, suppression of the right to organize, et cetera. And this is very important because much of the policy discussion is still very, very narrowly focused on privacy, I think in part because the policy discussion is still largely focused on consumers. So the more we can continue to lay out this very broad range of harms, the better, again, for the purposes of figuring out what do we actually want to regulate for. A second point that really comes out is that political economy profoundly shapes the introduction, impacts, and responses to technology. And I consider that the anchor of our field of industrial relations. Very critical when you're talking to policymakers who often still think technology drops down from the sky. And this really comes out in the papers, especially the one on electronic visit verification. Part of that is also being clear about what part of the story is the employer and what part is the technology. A very key differentiation, which also comes out from the papers. For example, there's nothing inherent about platform algorithms that dictates that pay must be piece rate, for example. And then finally, in terms of discrimination, currently in the policy world, there's a lot of focus on bias in the tech itself, like in hiring technology, where there's been very well documented bias in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of age, disability. That part of the research is very important, but what these studies lift up is that there are other sources of disproportionate harm, in particular occupational segregation. So workers of color, immigrants, and women are definitely more likely to work in the low-wage workplaces where this tech is being experimented with. And so continuing to document that will be important to ensure that policymakers don't just think we just have to regulate the bias in the tech and then we're done. So I really laud the papers for really pushing far out from the very traditional framing around technology and its impacts. Here are 4 things to focus on in research going forward. Some of this is a response to the papers, but more generally as a research field, again, through the lens of public policy. One is the question is, what is the prevalence of this tech? It is very hard to know right now how common it is. We're all, mainly relying on journalists, analyses of the tech itself, et cetera. But we are still very much at the beginning of the adoption of data-driven technologies. Most employers are not yet using most of these technologies. Figuring out prevalence is going to be very hard. This stuff is so obscure. Right now, there's few disclosure laws, but it's important because we shouldn't be designing public policy around rare scenarios, at least not in the first generation of policy. Second, not all tech is bad and not all uses of tech are bad. A critical point for policy. For sure, there's pernicious and unreliable tech like facial recognition that should just be banned, but most regulation will need to be regulation of uses and preventing harms. And the problem in particular is that a lot of this tech has very straightforward uses for production. So teasing this out in research will be critical. What drives an employer variation and how tech is used? That will be a very important question to answer to help guide us in regulating use. Third, there's a difference between employers, subcontractors, and vendors. And so we tend to focus on the employers as the key agent in determining working conditions, but that's really too narrow. If the subcontractor is a big company, they are probably using their own system that the employer doesn't have control over. Vendors may, and in most cases probably are the stronger entity determining the impact of tech via their own design decisions. Think of Kronos. So the model employer here is not Amazon. It's great that Amazon and the conditions at the warehouses have really become sort of the poster child for this, but that is not the modal scenario. The modal scenario is a mid-size employee who has very little understanding of this tech, who's just buying it from a vendor. So we really have to be rigorous about this in future research. And that leads to the final suggestion is that more generally, we need to study the technology production chain for workplace tech. We really have to think of this as like supply chain analysis. Let's apply that to technology production. Who's funding the tech? Who's designing it? Who's determining the goals? Who's marketing it? What is their power over in particular industries? And the reason that's important is that regulating employers will not be enough. For those of you who've thought about how do we regulate employers in this space, you quickly end up pushing the bounds of the space that you can regulate. We will have to directly regulate the vendors who are producing workplace tech itself, in addition to regulating employer uses. So those are four things that I would love to see, especially if there are younger researchers listening to this panel or thinking about their dissertation, that I would love to have them think about. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Annetta. And then finally, Chandra Childers. Did we lose Chandra? I wonder if she got dropped somehow. Well, while we wait for Chandra to come back on, I have a couple quick comments / questions on a couple of the papers. just in briefly in order, for Alexandra, you've probably seen this, but just in case not, Karen Levy's work on co-surveillance of retail workers and retail customers, which I thought had some nice intersections with what you were saying. For Luke, so I guess two questions, just like sort of situating this historically. One is, the workers today are, Instacart workers are not co-located in the way that many workers who were taking industrial action in the 19th century were. Not all of them, of course. Garment workers were often not co-located if they were doing home-based work. So, does that play into your analysis of their collective action? Second, and maybe a little more substantively, I almost sort of push back a little bit on the idea that this dynamic of informal action leading to changes at companies is that unusual. So, there's a canonical labor law case we all teach called Washington Aluminum, where some workers walk out of a aluminum plant in Baltimore on a day when it's the polar vortex has come down into Baltimore. It's the 1950s. And they're not unionized. They basically strike, and the Supreme Court decides that that's actually a protected strike. And you see this happen as an organizer in other cases. Another case that comes to mind is Walmart, where obviously still non-union, but a great deal of kind of grassroots pressure has preceded significant changes in company policy around healthcare and then wages. So to what extent is that a totally new phenomenon? We may not have time to take these up. Finally, Jasmine, just one thought I had for you, question I had for you. I was struck by the fact that a lot of the middle-class jobs that you, the list of middle-class jobs you posted were often in building and construction trades and other crafts work that is heavily unionized, and where unions have a long, unfortunate history of racial and gender discrimination. So I was just wondering to what extent, and sort of patterns, and this has been litigated, to the Supreme Court numerous times, patterns of informal referrals to jobs that end up perpetuating racial and gender exclusions. So I was wondering to what extent, if at all, that came up in your conversations. Do you have workers saying, well, look, I'd love to be a boiler fitter, or whatever, but I don't know anyone who can refer me into an apprentice program, et cetera. Do we want to, while we see if Chandra comes back, are there any other questions to pose to the panelists? Maybe we can take a few and then, give them some time to answer at the end. You can just raise hands virtually or wave your hand at me. All right, seeing none for now, but I'll keep it open. If any of you want to, I guess Luke and Jasmine, they were really questions for you too. If you have thoughts on either of those, I'd love to hear them. Or responses to another's comments as well, of course.
I'll have you go a second. Go ahead.
Sure, I can go briefly. Yeah, your question is a really interesting one. Essentially, do interviewees, are they talking about the racialized history of exclusion among the building trades? And so I'll say two things. So first, no, not as much as I would think. What I talk about in the paper is that what's interesting is just 15% of my respondents are actually able to effectively locate even one of those jobs, right? And asking them what jobs are good jobs. So there seems to be in the process of exclusion, it has created a vacuum of awareness. Again, hints back to the advocacy for there is not enough discussion and just to even disrupt the racism that's implicit sometimes in those industries. So unfortunately, the occupational segregation in some ways has led to kind of a lack of community-based knowledge about these occupations that, again, in being able to compare it to a Latinx sample is not the case, right? So these are deeply racially stratified processes that we know some groups are kind of tracked into, have social networks that push them towards certain jobs. But the thing I will say is that there was one incident, there was one student who, at the high school that I observed, they do have an off-site vocational training program that students can attend as an elective. There's kind of high barriers to entry because you have to take a 1-hour bus to get to this off-site. They don't advertise it well. And in that instant, a student was telling me about participating in that program. I was so excited to finally find a Black student who told me they did. And upon attending the class, they said that their experience was that they felt that the teacher was racially discriminatory towards them. And they attended for about a month and then decided that it was a hostile environment and they weren't interested. So there's some anecdotal experiences there, but what I was struck by more is how few people talked about these occupations altogether, and seeing that as a problem in and of itself.
It's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, very briefly, in response to those two great questions. Yeah, the lack of co-location is like an interesting one. There's a whole bunch, like, so first of all, 2 of the 3 folks leading the organizing effort at Instacart are women who happen to, coincidentally, they found each other on Instagram, but happen to live very near each other. And so actually became friends in the process. So I do think there's something about, bodily proximity that helps, stir up organizing efforts. However, they have basically an organizing committee on a Facebook Messenger thread of all women across the country. So they're certainly using technology to organize. And I think it is, I don't mean to overstate the similarities to the 19th century, but there certainly are some, on the how unique question of, I think just of course, like in capitalism, like workers sometimes get upset and they talk to each other and do things that change the conditions at work, like that kind of spontaneous action does happen. I thought of like the market basket strike, which was so bizarre, if folks remember, in New England a couple of years back, where they basically struck for one brother to retain control of the company. I'm from New Hampshire, so I followed it closely, and it was, so all kinds of things like that happened. But in this case, you've got the same workers leading multiple strikes over several years, around similar issues of pay, transparency and stability to the piece rate. And the company like not firing them systematically like companies do when workers organize, right? In an industrial environment, you find the leaders and you purge them and violate labor law and, try to kill any organizing efforts. So just very different. Like, so I don't want to overstate it, but I do feel like there's some pattern going on here that just really, for me, was resonant with the 19th century conflicts. Again, not 100%, and the end of the paper explores some of the differences, including the co-location issue. So thanks.
Yeah, and I'll say very briefly, the argument about the kind of historical continuities in worker action around piece rates, I thought made perfect sense. This wasn't a pushback or on that in any way, but just on those other factors. Alexandra or Kathryn, did you want to get in at all? No? Okay. I would put up hands if you would. We have a couple questions in the chat that I'll read out to the group. I think they're probably visible to everyone. From Ashke Mohan, I was curious what the panelists' view of the future of algorithmic management. Might be a good one for Alexandra. And then Rita Trevetti, I'd be interested to know if the panelists have found any trends on how the presence of standard monitoring as part of the business has impacted willingness to engage in union or other protected activity or organizing. I am also very interested in this question. Communication is usually seen as key, and particularly the ability to communicate in the workplace. How, if at all, do these chill or not chill such communication? When monitoring is a condition of the job, how can it be distinguished from unlawful surveillance under the NLRA? Any thoughts on those from the panelists? I'll put in a very brief plug. Sorry, Alexandra, go ahead.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to the side of algorithmic management, and also your earlier comment about Karen Levy's work and sort of the refractive surveillance element of it, and the fact that the data collection about one party can often be used to make decisions about another party, and as well as the ways in which sort of surveillance and monitoring of work could also have sort of coercive elements onto parties in addition to just the workers. So one example that sort of came up in my interviews was one case where I interviewed the mother of a developmentally disabled child who had several care attendants taking care of her child. And the system that they used basically required a facial verification system where if like a particular instance like triggered additional verification of the system, the workers basically have to snap a picture of themselves and then snap a picture of the person that they're caring for to be able to verify that they're in the same location. And she was telling me that, like, I trust my care attendants aren't going to physically coerce my child who does not like to sit still in front of cameras. But the fact that someone's paycheck is sort of riding on this coercive element of potentially like forcing someone to pose for a facial recognition system is incredibly troubling. So I think there's sort of broader ripple effects that need to be taken into account in the ways in which different kinds of management practices, particularly in these kinds of like triadic employment relationships where there's, the worker, there's the client, there's the home health care agency or the intermediary, or like, caseworkers, nurses, other institutions that all, and government, who all sort of, play a part in how work is managed on the ground, can sort of, change these dynamics.
Well, that brings us to time. I want to be cognizant of people's time and give everyone a break because the next session starts in 15 minutes. So let's get a quick round of applause for the panel. Thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you at the rest of the conference.